A line of men stood rigid beneath the torchlight, while the warden walked the row like a surgeon testing a pulse. He tapped a shin with his baton. The nearest prisoner swayed and did not fall, and the warden's thin satisfaction cut across the block. Fear, sharp and practical, sat behind the inmate's teeth and dictated every small move he made. He counted breaths to survive. He kept his knees locked because movement would register on the gaoler's watches and earn a correction. The cell block smelled of sweat, damp wool, and iron. The inmate had been in the standing sentence for days. His calves burned and the backs of his knees tightened into knots that stole his balance. Those concrete facts framed the problem plainly: stay upright or be punished publicly. He had no plan beyond breathing and remembering how to force one foot forward without actually leaning. The warden stopped at the inmate's face and studied him, grey eyes narrowed. Stand straighter. The warden. The voice had no urgency, only the flat rhythm of someone marking time. The inmate inhaled and found his jaw clenched. He did not answer. He had learned very early that speech could be recorded in the ledger the warden kept on his desk. Within those first minutes, the baseline of life had been established. The warden's inspection, the watches that measured posture, and a public expectation that pain would be visible. The inmate could not yet name the deeper cut: betrayal, when men sworn to maintain order used ritualized cruelty to advertise their authority. That sense of betrayal pushed him to look for small, permissible acts of resistance. Head gaoler's voice echoed down the corridor. Procedure: the head gaoler read, pronouncing the standing sentence rules as if they were scripture. He listed hours, rotation schedules, and the points at which guards should report any wobble. The words played like a clock. The inmate's mind mapped the hours into notches on his memory. 1 notch for the first watch, 2 for the second. He pressed his heel into the cold stone to keep his knees from buckling. A gaoler's boot scuffed at the plank beside him. The inmate recognized the rhythm, and with it came a new shift: doubt to fear. Doubt had crept in the night before, a whisper that perhaps leaning against the wall might buy a few seconds. Fear argued that even a second could be punished. He tested the edge of his restraint with a near-invisible weight shift. The head gaoler glanced over and the gaoler made a note on a thin strip of wood. The warden watched the notes, then the prisoner's, then his pocket watch. He tapped the watch as he walked. The sound was precise. The inmate counted with him, aligning breaths to the ticks. He stared at the single sputtering candle that the men were allowed and made it a small anchor. 10 breaths per wick flare, 15 per slow drip from a damp ceiling stain. A man 2 places down, Rurik, the cellmate, staggered. His knees bent and scribbles of anguish ran across his face. The inmate reached without breaking gaze, crushed by the necessity to help and to hide the help. He braced Rurik's arm. Hold him. The head gaoler barked, do not let him collapse. The warden did not remove his gaze. Rurik's legs gave twice. The gaolers dragged him upright and tied him to a post by the ankles, then wrapped straps across his torso to keep him vertical. The inmate felt betrayal sharpen again. This time it was not abstract. It became action. He had thought the sentence was temporary. The carved tally beneath Rurik's tunic proved otherwise. While steadying Rurik, the inmate's fingers brushed a raw edge under the man's shirt. He found a small carved notch along Rurik's hip and a piece of cloth folded into a tight scrap, a name stitched in an even thread. The discovery created new emotional shift. From fear to a cold clarity, the standing sentence repeated. The men were not isolated incidents. They were entries on a ledger of cruelty. A sympathetic guard, Jonas, whose face the inmate had noted the day before, lingered longer than the others. Jonas's eyes flicked to the tally and then to the warden. The guard's hesitation was a sign. Not all who wore the uniform agreed with the ritual. Jonas did nothing dramatic. He adjusted the straps a fraction, careful with the warden's sight. The inmate made the choice then to tuck the scrap of cloth into the seam of his tunic while no one watched. The small concealment felt like theft. It registered as a pulse of defiance that ran through the inmate's limbs. He tested that feeling by shifting his weight once more, letting his heels lift by millimeters. The head gaoler's voice cut across the block. Who moved? He demanded. Everyone's heads turned. The warden's hand snapped to his baton. Show us, he said to the head gaoler. The man nearest the warden, a gaoler named Merrick, stepped forward and pointed. That one, Merrick. He tried to sit. The inmate heard his own name in the accusation before anyone spoke it. The warden selected him by touching the brass keyring at his belt and pointed, "Bring him up." The warden ordered, "Make him an example." The inmate's breath shortened. The world narrowed to the board they called a plank, raised a handspan above the floor where everyone could see failure. They placed him on the plank in the central block. The board was rough under his soles. He felt the grain bite into his heels and the splintered edge press into his arches. Someone tightened a strap around his knees. The warden circled like a judge, listing every time the man had breathed or shifted. He announced adjustments to posture watches. The inmate clenched his fists to keep from letting his fingers tremble too obviously. "Hold still. The warden, if you fall, you will be shown to the yard. We will make your failure instructive." The words were rehearsed cruelty. The inmate's face went taut. He heard a shift in himself, fear condensing into anger at the law that permitted this. It was a change small enough to be invisible to the gaolers but large enough to alter the choices he might risk. The head gaoler stepped forward and prodded the man's thigh. "Bend." He snapped. The inmate did not comply. The warden's baton tapped the board beside the man's foot. The sound echoed. The gaolers leaned in. Then the inmate staggered. His knees threatened to betray him. The warden reached and seized his shoulder. The inmate found a reaction that was not purely reflex. He shoved back. "Do not touch me," he said, voice low. "Do not touch me." The warden repeated with a smile that had no humor. A string of rapid lines followed, an exchange the inmate had not intended but could not avoid. The warden, "You will stand," the inmate said. "I will not fail standing," the head gaoler barked. "Hold him, Marek." Marek grabbed the inmate's arm. The inmate twisted. He tried to free his hand. "Let go!" The warden ordered. Marek tightened his grip. 3 gaolers moved in a short, brutal rhythm. The inmate felt fingers press under his armpits and jerk him upright. Pain flared along straps and ligaments. He bit down to stop a sound. A twist came from inside him. Defiance pushed against the physical limit. The warden's ledger scratched a line. The immediate confrontation became the chapter's center of violence. When the struggle ended, the warden had arranged a new punishment. A raised plank, extra watches, and a public notation in his ledger about the inmate's example. Rurik's straps were tightened. The inmate's wrists bore raw marks where Marek had gripped them. Jonas looked away while a single bead of sweat slid into his collar. The inmate discovered that the ledger was not just bookkeeping, it was a tool of demonstration. Left bruised at the center of the block, the inmate steadied himself. He pressed the scrap of cloth into his palm and felt the carved notch under his fingernail. The tali had been a pattern across prisoners. That pattern changed his sense of what the sentence represented. It was not a correction meant to be endured and then forgotten. It was ongoing policy. Recovery came not as an inward monologue, but as action. The inmate learned where to place his weight, to keep his balance for longer. He learned to angle his hips so that straps would chafe on callus instead of raw skin. He whispered to Rurik when they were close enough. "Hold on," he told him. Rurik answered with one short groan and the name of his child. The exchange anchored them to a life beyond standing. Each day the warden adjusted routines to extract more display. He ordered that prisoners be moved into positions where the light caught every tremor. He instructed Marek to scrape the boards until they squealed under soles. He ordered longer watches. When the warden spoke, the gaolers repeated his words precisely and wrote them in small, neat script. Jonas moved differently now. He passed a bowl of thin soup in a manner that avoided the warden's notice. Once, when no one watched, he loosened a strap by a half, finger width, and the inmate felt the slack like relief. The inmate could not trust these small mercies. Each one tested a different reaction, hope shifting back quickly into suspicion. That was another emotion change, cautious hope to wary distrust. The inmate kept a private tally in his head. Every 3 to 5 days something new happened. A man collapsed, a guard had a flare of conscience, a strap snapped, a new rule extended the hours. These external events forced decisions. He learned to speak only when necessary and then in short phrases that could be mistaken for obedience. Once, during a late watch, the inmate overheard the warden speak to the head gaoler in a low voice. "Make it visible." The warden, "Make it a lesson." The head gaoler replied, "They are breaking, sir. We can extract testimony without killing them." The warden smiled at that and said, "We do not kill. We teach. Pain makes memory. The exchange shifted the inmate's understanding of motive. The ledger was not about record. It was about fear as spectacle. A mid-chapter twist presented itself when the inmate discovered that the head gaoler kept his own ledger separate from the warden's. While he had been steadying Rurik, the head gaoler's clerk had dropped a folded paper. The inmate caught a glimpse. The paper listed names with dates and small notes of behavior not recorded in the warden's book. The revelation reframed the earlier assumption that all cruelty was singular. The head gaoler maintained punishments for reasons beyond the warden's policy. That discovery forced a choice. The inmate could reveal the paper to Jonas and risk immediate reprisals, or he could keep it folded in his tunic and wait for evidence. He chose secrecy. Delay bought him time to test allegiances. The moment became a mini cliffhanger. The ledger in the head gaoler's hand suggested motives that might change who could be trusted. Arguments followed typical rhythms. Short lines, sharp interruptions. The inmate heard Merrick say, he moved, the warden, punish him higher, the head gaoler, we will not break him beyond repair. We need testimony, the inmate replied under his breath. You will have it when I can hold it. A small, public argument flared and ended in the warden's signature laugh. The warden's doctrine hardened. He called a small meeting in the inspection alcove and articulated why the standing sentence existed. Pain must be visible, he said. It must be recorded. It must be repeatable. He recommended adjustments to posture watches and mandated that punishments be scheduled to maximize visibility to other prisoners. The head gaoler noted each point, fingers tapping. This was not an abstract exhortation. It was policy written in the ledger and enforced in the block. That speech turned the warden into something the inmate could name, architect. The warden believed in the ritualization of pain and treated bodies like instruments. The inmate felt anger sharpen into planning. He would not speak loudly of rebellion. He would survive and then bear witness. The decision narrowed his options and made his daily acts deliberate. As the days folded into one another, the inmate practiced small deceptions. He pretended to fix his collar while slightly shifting his weight to ease a cramp. He pressed the rough grain of the plank into a pattern under his toes and used it to time micro-rests. When Merrick tightened a strap too far, Jonas's brief but deliberate touch adjusted it later. Those moments were actions with consequences. Each guard's gesture changed the social calculus inside the block. Then the warden chose him for an exemplar. The man at the center of the plank already bore the marks of the struggle. The warden raised his baton and addressed the assembled prisoners. This man will show you the cost of failure, he said. Watch him. Learn from him. The gaolers tightened the circle. The inmate felt all heads on him. He stumbled once. The warden's hand gripped him. He shoved back. The warden ordered Merrick to hold him. The inmate lunged in instinct, and a gaoler reacted by slapping his shoulder hard. The sudden motion brought a flash of physical pain, and then a sharper moral clarity. If he broke now, it would be recorded and used to teach. He staggered, sucked air, and locked his knees. The climax unfolded in a brief, violent sequence. The warden's baton tapped the board, then hit the strap. Merrick tightened the strap. The inmate's fingers curled around the scrap of cloth hidden in his seam. He pressed the fabric between thumb and forefinger until he could feel the thread cut into his skin. The tactile detail steadied him. He did not fall. The gaolers counted the seconds and marked them down. The warden nodded toward his ledger and closed it with a soft smack. He wrote a line, exemplar successful. The inmate felt something like victory, but it was brittle. The warden had given him survival in exchange for display. The exchange hardened into a new fact. Survival required being a visible lesson. In the immediate aftermath, the inmate sat in a dim corner of the block with Rurik leaning against him. The warden recorded the incident in his book and then locked the ledger away. Jonas came close and dropped a thin scrap of bread at their feet. He quietly, keep the tally. Tell it when you can. The inmate put the scrap into his mouth without chewing and felt the dry bite of starch and relief. He then took the hidden scrap of cloth from his seam and pressed it into his palm. He counted the carved notches again. Each notch represented a man. Each name stitched into the fabric reminded him that this was an entrenched method. He pressed the cloth into a narrow fold inside his tunic where no hand would find it by accident. He felt the weight of it against his sternum like a small, secret ledger. The last action of the chapter is precise. The warden closed his book and pushed past the prisoners, keys jangling at his hip. His coat brushed the candle flame and left a smear of soot on the warden's cuff. The inmate watched the smear, then looked down at his own bruised knuckles. He straightened. He slipped a finger under the carved notch and traced it. He mouthed a name, the cellmate's child's name, then slid the scrap fully away. He did not speak a promise aloud. He made a plan measurable in small actions. Live, collect witness, and keep the proof folded until it could change a ledger of its own. The blocks settled back into the rhythm of watches. Guards moved like clock hands. The inmate held posture while his body ached. He kept the tolly secret in his palm. The warden's ledger sat closed in the inspection alcove, and the warden himself walked the corridor with a satisfied, clinical gait. The inmate let his knees tremble once in private, then steadied himself and counted to 30. A knock sounded at the outer gate, an external event that cut across the measured night and demanded attention. The gaolers answered the knock and the warden's eyes sharpened. The chapter ends with a concrete action. Jonas slipped the inmate a folded scrap of paper with a single name on it, the name of a guard who might be turned. Jonas mouthed, "Wait." The inmate folded the new name into the same seam where he kept the tolly. The warden's footsteps receded. The inmate stood and resumed his position on the plank, less a passive body than a repository of records, pain, and unfinished testimony. He did not yet know how he would bear witness, but he had a small, stolen ledger beneath his ribs and the memory of the warden's hand on his shoulder. The block closed its doors for the night and the tally continued. A gaoler shoved the inmate upright as the warden's baton struck the man's shin. The snap of wood hit bone. The inmate blinked, mouth full of salt and grit, and breathed through the pain because the rotunda had eyes and rules. Fear was the engine of every motion that night. Fear tightened the inmate's knees and forced his hands to clench the rail. He had not come to the rotunda to beg. He had come to test whether he could still choose when his body wanted to collapse. The warden stepped forward, coat collar high, keys a soft cluster against his hip. The round stone gallery smelled of torch smoke and damp iron. The inmate remembered the first roll, call from the previous watch, a line of men rigid, while the warden walked the row and tapped a shin with that same baton. He remembered that tap because the man had not fallen then. That memory shaped how he moved now. The rotunda inspection began with a demand, "Hold your feet." The warden, "Do not bend." The assistant gaoler backhanded the nearest shoulder. "Stand," he added, quick and precise. The inmate answered with a small shift on his heels, the only move that kept muscle from quivering into surrender. He counted breaths. Fear pushed him to stay still. Doubt hovered behind each count. Would a stumble mean a body dragged away, or a needle of something worse? He was 28. He had arrived at the prison lean and defiant and had watched his muscles thin under the sentence that required standing. He did not own a past the warden would accept. He owned a scrap of cloth and a memory of old convict's hands teaching a small trick to ease a calf. He kept those things close to his body. He kept his eyes on the warden. The warden kept his face like a ruler testing a coin. The assistant gaoler, a younger man with a narrow jaw, circled the inmates with a lamp. He spoke once, low, "Rotate watches. Tighten the lines. Remove comforts." The warden tapped the inmate's shin with the baton again and did not wait for reply. The click of the brass keys sounded like sentence and promise. The inmate felt another shift in emotion. Doubt had become urgent alarm. He straightened his shoulders, let the alarm harden into a careful plan to survive the check. They moved the block back to the walkway. The warden spoke to the gaolers in measured sentences that left no room for interpretation. Longer watches. No stools. No leaning. Report any trimmer. His voice was even. The assistant gaoler wrote names into a slate. The inmate watched the slate like a ledger of futures. He heard old convict grunt beside him and offer a whispered counsel. "Use your feet like a metronome." Old convict, shift at the candle. Breathe on the count. "Don't trust the back." The inmate took the scrap of cloth and wrapped it behind his thigh as old convict had shown him. That contact grounded him. It was a small action, but it shifted something from simple endurance to deliberate resistance. The inmate's fear bent into concentration. By late evening the warden had tightened rotation and abolished small comforts. The assistant gaoler reorganized the watch list under his orders and moved the younger gaolers through the corridor like chess pieces. The inmate watched how the assistant gaoler checked names, how he hesitated over certain entries, and how his eyes flicked once to a door marked infirmary. A new emotion appeared, suspicion. The inmate watched for signs that the standing sentence was not merely punishment. He had seen men break before. He had read the ledger folded inside the infirmary once, enough to understand pattern rather than chance. His suspicion nudged him into action. He made a plan to meet the medical clerk when the clerk finished suturing an old wound. The infirmary was a narrow alcove off the walkway. The medical clerk moved with the precision of a man who had cleaned corpses and bandaged living limbs until the two felt the same. He did not make eye contact. When the inmate was forced for a check, the clerk motioned him behind a curtain. The clerk slid a thin book from his pocket and pushed it across the table. "Look. Take it, keep it hidden." The midland light from a single lamp fell on a page of names and notations. Dates, watch times, and shorthand marks that read like experiment logs. "This is a list," the clerk said. "We keep failures. We mark when they break. Those numbers matter. They watch for collapse." The inmate touched the paper. The names made private suffering into a planned sequence. The emotion in the inmate shifted again. Alarm moved into anger. He whispered, "Who you to note them?" The clerk's hand tightened and he looked toward the warden's door. "Orders," he said, "from above. From the man with the keys. The warden knows which ones to push." The inmate folded the ledger into his tunic beneath the scrap of cloth. He left with a heavier chest and a sharper purpose. Outside, a gaoler on the pre-dawn patrol stepped. The apprentice shoved past a column and collided with an exhausted man. One hand found a shoulder. A man staggered. The inmate watched the line ripple like stones thrown into a shallow pool. A jolt of recognition ran through the block. The warden's head turned. He saw the motion as threat. He did not ask. He ordered a roundup. "Form ranks." The warden, "Names? Now!" His voice lost the clinical cadence and snapped into command. The assistant gaoler barked names and struck a man who dared rub his calf. The inmate felt the shift. The warden's clinical mask cracked into impatience. Fear rose again, but it had been tempered into calculation. The inmate set his jaw and decided to make a choice that would force the punishment into sunlight. At dawn, in the central punishment cell, he let himself fall. He timed it for the moment the warden's back faced the door. He shifted both feet, loosened a calf, and let his knees give. He hit the floor with the sound of a body hitting old stone. The room held its breath. The warden whirled. The assistant gaoler stepped forward. Old convict made a sound like he had been punched. The inmate did not beg. He did not whine. He lay on the cold stone, lungs grasping for steady counts. "You broke line," the warden, already turning cruel. "You choose collapse." The assistant gaoler hauled the inmate up. "By my hand you stand," he said. The inmate let his weight drop again and managed a word. "I won't be a silent measure." His voice was thin but clear. The warden's face altered. The slow authority stuttered. "He barked orders, bring the ledger!" "Bring the clerk!" He wanted to show the block that collapse met a ritual. A punishment would be visible and public so that the standing sentence seemed invincible. They dragged the inmate to the center of the chamber. The medical clerk arrived, face pale. The warden read aloud a notation from the ledger, intending the words to sound like proof. He refused to stand. He refused order. The clerk looked at the warden and then at the inmate. He hesitated, as if a detail inside the ledger changed something in his throat. A rapid exchange broke out between the warden and the clerk. "What does it say?" The warden demanded. "It says they broke months ago." The clerk replied, "Which ones?" The warden, "Several. Marks here and here." The clerk pointed, voice low. "Who authorized this record?" The warden snapped. "You did." The clerk. The warden's jaw tightened. He looked at the inmate as if the man had named him. The confrontation stretched. In 3 quick lines the assistant gaoler argued, "We need compliance. We need order." Old convict spat, "Order kills." The warden's eyes narrowed and his foot tapped a rhythm that the men in the circle felt like the counting of a sentence. The inmate listened to the warden's voice fray with the first true anger the man had shown. The outburst was not measured cruelty anymore. It was personal. The warden ordered a punitive escalation. He chose to break bodies to prove a point. He ordered the removal of the talisman, the slapping of faces, the prolonged watch at the block for those nearest the fall. The assistant gaoler obeyed with a quick efficiency that made the inmate's teeth ache. "Bring the rope," he said. "Strip the line. We will show them compliance." The old convict stepped forward, hand lifted in a useless protection. He looked at the warden and said, "You retesting more than resolve, sir. You retesting limits that will end men." The warden's response was a measured strike. "Limits are results. Results keep order." The punishment unfolded like laboratory procedure. Men were forced into positions. Hands were kept at angles that made balance impossible. The inmate watched faces. He watched the assistant gaoler's hands tremble once as he tied a strap. He watched the warden's mouth set like iron. The emotional arc bent in a brutal line, fear to fury to cold calculation. The inmate felt both the physical ache and the moral clarity of the moment. His plan had been to force a confrontation where proof existed. During the ritual, the medical clerk moved close and slipped the inmate a folded page. He mouthed, "Hide it. Tell them." The inmate folded the paper into his palm and let his heart count the seconds. That small secret was a new object of power. It changed his role. He no longer only survived. He collected evidence. A gaoler miss, stepped again on patrol. That mistake triggered another round of shouting. The assistant gaoler's apprentice knocked over a lantern. The sudden flare threw shadow across faces. For a moment the warden's escalation had made the rotunda more chaotic than he intended. The warden's eyes snagged on the ledger and a name that matched an earlier mark. Something in the ledger connected the warden to an order no one openly discussed. The inmate heard a new sound from the warden, anger threaded with fear of exposure. The warden barked, "Secure him.
Make example!"
Several men grabbed the inmate and forced him upright. He stood breathing, with the scrap of cloth pressed to his thigh and the ledger folded in his fist beneath it. Old convict caught his eye and held up 2 fingers, a quick count of the watch. The inmate understood the signal: hold one watch, then another. Endure. At the peak of the confrontation, the inmate made a small but decisive move. He loosened the strap enough to topple the nearest man's balance for a single heartbeat. That heartbeat turned into loud confusion. Voices rose into a knot of accusation. In 3 quick exchanges, the warden ordered the apprentice to bring heavier restraints while the assistant gaoler argued for swift humiliation. Words turned to shoves, shoves into groans. The inmate let his knees go again and collapsed to the floor with the ledger exposed between his fingers so the clerk's inked names showed through the laced gaps of his tunic. Silence fell faster than the warden wanted. Men looked at the ledger. The warden's face hardened into a shape that tried to hide panic. The assistant gaoler stepped forward and tried to snatch the ledger. Old convict blocked his arm. "Let him speak. Old convict, let him show what you've been doing." The warden's mouth opened. The scene tightened into a different pressure. A reveal that could change more than one schedule. The mid-chapter cliffhanger arrived when the medical clerk, standing a foot behind the warden, pushed a page into the light where everyone could see the marks. The ledger entry exposed a name that matched a gaoler who had fallen months before under the standing sentence. The entry read with dates and a note. Failed watch, unrecorded pain, sample ended, the room inhaled. The inmate lay on the stone, pulse rattling, and felt the weight of possibility shift. Would the ledger bring change or retribution? The warden tried to take control. He shouted, "Seize that ledger. Confiscate the clerk." The assistant gaoler moved like a man who needed to obey to survive. Old convict grabbed the inmate and helped him to his feet. The inmate's hands were steady now. He met the warden's gaze and said, "People will see this. They will know what you kept here." His voice did not tremble. A final rapid exchange cut through the morning air. "You bring shame." The warden, "You earned it." The assistant gaoler replied, voice flat, "Who ordered it?" The inmate, "The clerk." "You did." The clerk answered, then added, "And men above you wanted numbers." The warden's shoulders slumped for a breath. That gave the inmate room to act. He tucked the ledger into his tunic and the scrap of cloth into his fist. He felt old convict's hand press briefly against his back. By the time dawn leaked through the cracked window, the warden had staged a ritualized punishment meant to terrify. The assistant gaoler had performed the sequence with practiced skill. The medical clerk had shown the ledger and then retreated. The old convict had spared what he could. The inmate stood at the cell threshold, battered but alive, talisman hidden and ledger secured. He met old convict's eye and nodded. They did not speak long. The inmate had fear in a new shape. It had become the belief that telling would mean more risk, but not telling would mean continued deaths. He stepped into the corridor with concrete proof and the determination to survive. He moved with a limp and a slow breath. The warden watched from the doorway, keys glittering in the lamp. For all the ritual and the order, the warden had shown a crack that morning. The inmate knew that crack could widen. He also knew that a ledger and a scrap of cloth could only hold sway if he lived long enough to place them where others could find them. The chapter ends with the inmate moving past the warden's door and into the hallway. Old convict called his name once. "Keep the ledger, boy," the inmate answered. "I will." He kept walking. The final sound in the rotunda was the soft clink of the warden's keys as the door closed behind him. That closing was a beat of action and decision. The inmate's next step was a promise he could prove with paper and a witness, not with speeches or fate. A man pitched forward at the dawn roll call. A gaoler yanked him upright and spat. "Stand." Fear tightened in the inmate's knees, fear that had guided his every breath for days, and he shifted his weight, counting the seconds between lamp flickers to hold himself upright. The warden paced overhead on his inspection platform, brass keys clinking against the heavy wool of his coat as he moved. The central question hung in the corridor. Would the vigil be driven until men broke, or would enforcement buckle first? The inmate kept his eyes on the candle flame near his feet and let his memory do work no one else could see. He had stood through the first roll call when the warden tapped shins with his baton and smiled at the slight sway. He had watched a gaoler snap a man's tibia in the rotunda until the man stayed standing only because he could not fall. Those events were facts the inmate carried like a tally in his closed hand. Fear was the engine and calculation his survival tool. Every small decision, rocking on heels, shifting weight, pushing toes, was made to keep the tally intact and to keep a record hidden. A low murmur ran along the line when the man nearest the inmate sagged again. Gaoler Bren reached out without ceremony and hauled the fallen man's shoulder until the man's jaw clenched and his eyes cleared. Bren the inmate mouthed once to himself, counting that name among the living, and then watched Bren's jaw. The gaoler's hands were steady, his breath did not tremble. The inmate read steadiness as a possible fault line or a tool. He had learned to read hands as others read weather. The warden's voice cut across the gallery extension. 2 more days, no leaning, no support. Any who sit will receive the rod and public example. He pronounced each clause like a surgeon listing instruments. Guards shifted but said nothing. The head gaoler nodded once and clipped the order with a sound that matched the brass on the warden's keyring. The inmate felt the shift in the block's rhythm, more rounds, stricter eyes, fewer whispered risks. After the announcement, the inmate felt suspicion bloom where fear had lived. He watched the head gaoler's lips tighten and saw the guarded look the prison clerk exchanged with a nearest guard. The inmate's suspicion pushed him to act. He had a scrap of cloth folded into a narrow strip and pressed it into his palm until the lines of the cloth matched the lines of his skin. The scrap would be his tally sheet. The act of hiding it was rooted in doubt that the warden's pronouncements would be recorded honestly. Outside the gallery, a junior gaoler hesitated when the warden barked in order to strike a slumped man. The warden tapped the baton twice on the bench and said, "Show me weakness, and I will make you an example." The junior gaoler's hand trembled as he drew his stick, then faltered. A gaoler is meant to obey. Hesitation is contagious in a room of standing bodies. The inmate watched the hand and felt a new current of possibility. If a single gaoler refused, the ritual might break. A neighboring prisoner pressed a folded scrap into the inmate's hand during the inspection. Fingers quick, eyes urgent. "Hide it," the neighbor said under breath, and the word hit the inmate like a bell. He nodded and tucked the scrap into the seam of his tunic, where the rope mark around his wrist hid the movement. The neighbor's name was Thomas, and he had been standing 2 places down during that first roll call when the warden walked the line and tapped shins to test resolve. Thomas's gesture carried the memory of that night like a weight transferred. Later, alone with the candle's thin light, the inmate unfolded the scrap and made a small tally. Names, injuries, times of collapse. He marked the gaoler who had refused with a small cross and wrote, "Bren," hesitated, beside it. The action changed him from one who merely endured into one who documented. That decision altered his posture. He no longer counted only breaths but also the minutes until a possible delivery beyond the walls. The torchlight gave the inmate a new center. It made each ache and bruise evidence rather than mere endurance. News arrived mid-morning. A clerk had been seen at the magistrate's office with a sealed complaint. The prison clerk muttered it in the administrative alcove, the words clipped and flat. "Magistrates ask for reports. They will come if wounds are visible." The head gaoler's face went hard. He glanced at the warden as if measuring the distance between ritual and exposure. The inmate heard the exchange through the iron grating and felt the angle of danger change. Fear stepped aside. Suspicion hardened into calculation. If officials inspected, the warden needed visible obedience and visible discipline to deny impropriety. That afternoon the warden tightened the rules again. He stood on his platform and listed penalties: public lashes, forced kneeling while the rotunda watched, isolation with no light, disorder is contagion, he told them. His words were a different kind of tool. He wielded humiliation and spectacle as precisely as his baton. The inmate watched the men's faces in the line. Some bowed eyes, some clenched teeth. A few men, children once and now gaunt, had stopped mouthing names under breath and instead counted with their fists. The warden's ritual of visible pain was meant to make magistrates see order. In the rotunda at noon a small eruption began that no one planned outright. A man in the middle of the line went white and folded. A gaoler leaned in to strike as ordered. Gaoler Bren stepped forward and stopped the blow with his hand. "No," Bren, voice low but steady, and the room inhaled. "He is done." The warden looked down from his platform with an expression that held both surprise and contempt. Bren, the warden, and the single syllable carried accusation. Bren answered with movement instead of excuse. He pushed between two men and hauled the collapsed prisoner to the side for a quick check. Head gaoler barked, "Up, Bren." The command snapped through the rotunda, but Bren kept the man supported. Tumas reached across and tore the rope binding from the man's wrists to check circulation. The inmate watched their hands and registered a sequence. Compassion enacted as small bodily defiance. The warden stepped down from the platform to intervene directly. His baton rose in a practiced arc. The warden swung to restore order, and the gaoler's pause turned into a shove. A prisoner surged forward, not toward escape, but to block the baton. "Stop." The prison clerk shouted from the gallery, and in that second the baton's strike met the collarbone of a man who had leapt to shield another. The warden staggered, surprised, and his baton fell from his hand to the stone with a crack that matched an earlier snap the inmate remembered, the sound of bone meeting wood. Someone struck the warden back. A heavy hand found his coat, and an object, perhaps the pocket watch or a corner of the brass keyring, was used like a blunt instrument. The rotunda dissolved into scrapings of movement. Bodies closing, guards yelling, prisoners shoving toward the platform. The inmate felt his breath hitched and then forced into regular counts. He did not join the first surge. Instead, he crouched almost imperceptibly and pulled his scrap tighter into a hidden fold. The immediate threat was raw and unpredictable. He held his hidden record with both hands, if it were the single thing that could translate that day's violence into an accusation that would reach beyond these stone walls. 3 quick exchanges of shouted names followed. "Bren." "Stop," the warden demanded, voice failing toward panic. "Head gaoler, restrain them." The head gaoler lunged, then found himself held back by 2 older gaolers who remembered other orders. "Enough," one of them said, his voice blunt. "Not here." The argument snapped into a string of 3-6 quick lines, each clipped and edged. "You have orders," the head gaoler insisted. "Orders came from you." Another countered. The warden's breath came shallow. His face went sallow under the candlelight. When the struggle ended, the warden lay on the stone, his heavy coat caked with sweat and a smear of blood at his temple where someone had struck him. The gaoler who had hesitated earlier had stepped forward to tie the warden's wrists with a length of rope while head gaoler argued feverishly with the prison clerk. The inmate watched as the chain of command, once a neat procession of rituals, became a messy negotiation over custody and consequence. The warden's keys rattled on the floor and someone, Bren, likely picked them up and turned them in his palm as a man turning evidence. In the aftermath, the rotunda felt smaller and louder because every footfall echoed with decision. The head gaoler ordered some men seized and others tended, carry him out. Take him to the infirmary, he said, but the voice lacked the easy certainty it had held earlier. The inmate was half carried to a corner by two gaolers who had once gone through the motions of baton and compliance but now bore his weight because their choices had shifted. His tunic scraped the floor and the candle's smoke rose over them, marking motion with a concrete smell of oil and iron. On the crude stretcher, the inmate watched the warden as gaolers sealed the warden's office and set a guard at the door. The prison clerk fetched a small sealed folder from his coat and thumped it onto a low table as if presenting evidence in a courtroom. The inmate clutched his tali in his pocket and felt the paper's edges against his skin like proof. He had begun this vigil to survive himself. Now survival had become transmission, proof to hand to the clerk, to the magistrates, to someone who would read names and dates and know that standing had been used as punishment and spectacle. The inmate had not anticipated the scale of the warden's fall. He had expected a refusal to strike here or a discreet exchange of scraps there. He had not expected the gaolers to turn on the warden while the line still stood. The twist, Bren's open refusal, Thomas's passing of the scrap, the clerk's quiet complaint to the magistrates, changed the structure of power. The inmate realized, in a clear physical way, that a ritual depends on anonymity. Once that tissue breaks, the whole apparatus leaks. In the infirmary corridor, the prison clerk sat the sealed folder down and looked at the inmate. "We will need your name where you marked it," he said. Voice flat. "They will ask specifics." The inmate nodded and, with a trembling hand, prepared to hand over the hidden tali. He slid the scrap across the table, and the clerk's fingers closed over it, reading quickly. The clerk's face, composed but tired, revealed nothing that could comfort the inmate. He carried the weight of official words and the shape of documents. His outward calm told the inmate the magistrates would process this now as paperwork rather than immediate rescue. Outside, the sound of boots shifted cadence as officials arrived in the gatehouse. The head gaoler barked orders and then slowed when two men in different trim entered. Inspectors from the magistrate's office, whose eyes moved between wounds and records with a practiced detachment. The inmate's hope tightened and released like a muscle. It was not the same as certainty. He had expected either freedom or brutal reprisal, not the bland machinery of inquiry. He watched the clerk hand over the sealed folder to one of the inspectors, and for the first time he felt what his tali might do. Act as a hinge between private endurance and public remedy. The aftermath left bodies and arguments. The warden's office was sealed and the head gaoler gave orders that tried to reassert order while avoiding a direct accusation. "We follow process," the head gaoler announced, though his voice lacked unassailable authority. Bren stayed near the rotunda threshold and Thomas returned to his place in the line. Both men moved with different weight than before. Their choices had consequences. Each time they acted, someone else shifted. The inmate, carried toward the infirmary, kept his count of breaths and added the clerk's face to his mental list of ankles. A man who would take a sealed record to outside eyes. 2 days later, the magistrates had their report. They examined Mark's bruises and the warden's injuries and summoned the head gaoler and several named witnesses. The inmate sat in a narrow room under a sputtering lamp while an official read entries aloud from the sealed folder. He heard his name and Thomas's, Bren's refusal, and the memory of the warden striking a shin in the rotunda read back as a recorded incident. The inmate felt a brittle relief move through him, relief that was specific and edged, not an imaginary restoration. Paper and signatures could not replace aching legs, but they could change custody and consequences. In the final motions, the warden was restrained, not executed. The magistrates leaned toward legal remedies. Removal from command, formal inquiry, perhaps prosecution. The head gaoler was reprimanded and then placed in a position where his testimony would color the warden's fate. Bren was called forward and his hesitation was framed as reluctant courage. Thomas's name was marked as informant. The inmate listened to words that rearranged who would stand accused and who would stand judged. When the inmate was carried to the infirmary for a final wound check, he slid a folded scrap into the clerk's hand and said only, "Make sure they read every name." The clerk looked at him with a quick, human flicker, understanding, maybe pity, and nodded. Outside, the courtyard gate closed with a weight that sounded like a door bolted on a chapter. The gaolers sealed the warden's office, and the rotunda, once an instrument of ritual, felt for a moment like a room whose rules had been reordered by hands. The inmates' immediate conflict, the need to remain upright and the need to record, ended in a fragile resolution. The vigil continued for some. Others were seized or tended. The warden lost his control. The tali existed now as evidence carried beyond the block. The inmate's body would still bear scars. He still woke with cramps and loose sensation in his calves, but the choice to document had altered the path of pain into testimony. He had moved from mere endurance to deliberate witness. That evening the inmate watched from a small cot as the head gaoler argued with the prison clerk about how to present the evidence. "We must not inflame the magistrates with claims we cannot prove," the head gaoler, voice edged with caution. "We must be precise," the clerk replied. "Precise is what we did, names and dates, nothing more." The back and forth was short, each line economical and sharp. The inmate felt the voices shape what would be known and what would remain closed to the public eye. A week later the inmate was handed a small, sealed paper certifying that he had been recorded as a witness. He pressed the paper to his chest and felt the ridged edge of the folds, a physical proof of what he had done. The gaolers who had stood with him, Bren and Thomas among them, moved through the rotunda in new ways. Their shoulders bore the imprint of choices they had made in public. The warden's absence created a vacancy that would be filled by new men and new methods. But the immediate structure of ritualized enforcement had cracked and would be watched now by magistrates rather than merely enforced from above. On a late afternoon, as officials packed the warden's office for removal, the inmate folded his tali one last time and slid it into his tunic seam where the rope mark hid his action. He watched Bren lift the warden's keyring and hand it without ceremony to the head gaoler, who passed it to the clerk for inventory. The transfer of brass and leather felt like transfer of responsibility. The inmate felt no triumph. His relief was concrete and small. A paper, a seal, a transfer of keys. He kept counting breaths, but now his breath, counting, had a different aim, to measure days until the magistrate's decision took effect. Outside the rotunda, gaoler sealed the warden's office door, and the prison clerk set the sealed folder into a small satchel bound for the magistrate's carriage. The inmate's last concrete act in the chapter was to press his hidden tali, folded and creased, into the clerk's palm and to say, quietly, "Read them all." The clerk closed his hand around the paper, nodded once, and pushed the satchel toward the corridor. The gaoler pushed the sealed tali toward the clerk. 2 hard knocks sounded at the outer gate.